Hello. Been talking to some of you out and about today, but for those I haven't met yet, my name's Ben. I work at a company called Twilio. Has anyone in here heard of Twilio? A couple of people. Has anyone in here used Twilio? Wow. I've got a job to do today, which is fantastic. So first of all, thanks for coming along today. It's a fantastic building here. It's actually my first time in Copenhagen, but what a great city. Having come from London, where I'm based, while San Francisco is lovely, most of Europe is significantly older and better looking than anywhere in the US. And so I love coming from London and travelling around other European cities where we have this thing called history. So thank you for welcoming all of us here into to Copenhagen for today. Lots of us have travelled from various different places to be here and talk. I've come over from London for this API tour, so we were in Stockholm yesterday and we're in Helsinki tomorrow, and at some point we'll find some time to sleep. But I wanted to kind of come along towards the end of the day today and talk a bit more about some of the things that people have talked about already, but frame them from the point of view of someone that has worked with and made an API happen. So how many of you in here would say you are software developers? How many of you in here would say you're not software developers? What would you say you are? Business manager. Great. I have a room mix of people, which is great. Quite a lot of software developers, though, which is always good. So software developers, people that have worked with APIs before, generally. Yeah, we've got some heads nodding, which is great. Interestingly, if you search for API on Google and then hit the image search button, the first thing you see is this. And I'm actually not joking. If you go and do a Google image search for API, the very first thing is flames. But when you do text search results, searching for API, the headlines that you get aren't actually much better. When you start looking at APIs, certainly from the point of view of someone who's maybe never built or worked with an API before, you get some fantastic headlines like Snapchat's API hacked and exploits published. Does anyone here use Snapchat? It's not just teenagers then. So Snapchat's API was a private API, was not a public API. They had an API that made their applications talk to their web service. They did not spend any time securing it. Security kind of important. And so it was able to be very easily hacked by, as I understand it, someone just plugging their iPhone in via their laptop and using Wireshark. And they were able to look at the traffic that was being sent from the app to Snapchat, work out what the API did, and then exploit that. They were able to get lots of people's phone numbers and have access to the pictures that people were sending to each other, which I'm sure were completely above board. But then the headlines that you look at around APIs range from something like that to even more bizarre things. So we've all heard about the Internet of Things, but one of my favorite API-related headlines is refrigerators send 750,000 malicious emails. We actually live in a world where your fridge is a spammer. So, yeah, well, I don't normally keep spam in the fridge, but so when you start thinking about headlines like this, you actually start to think, well, days like this are great, and we've heard some fantastic things about APIs and how to build APIs and how to use them, but should I actually bother? If all people are going to do is try and exploit my API, hack my API, try and get my fridge to send emails, why should I touch an API with a 10-foot pole when I could just not do anything with an API? Everything will be nice and closed and I don't have to worry about people taking advantage of things. And hopefully over the next few minutes of talking to you, we'll go through some of those pitfalls and why actually all of the stuff you've heard today is really important, and ignoring APIs because they're a little bit scary is possibly one of the worst things you can do. So I mentioned before I work for a company called Twilio, and Twilio is an API. I'm very fortunate to actually work for a company whose entire purpose is building an API. We don't have any products that sit on top of that API. That's what other people build. So Twilio is an API for telecommunications, voice, messaging, so things like MMS and MMS, and voice over IP, and now things like SIP as well. So what we do is, if you think about kind of telcos and telephony companies in a bubble over here, they've got their cloud. If we're going to use the cloud buzzword, there's a cloud over here, and it's a network of devices and services and protocols just like any other network. Your phone number is your IP address, and then there are different protocols that send different things to that device. And typically, that cloud where telcos live is really closed. There are no APIs, no real standards, and you have to pay an awful lot of money to get access to it. If you compare that to the internet cloud over here, which we're all a lot more familiar with, where each device has an IP address, much in the same way as this cloud, but it's based much more on open standards and frameworks and things that people can build on top of, and relatively cheap access. What Twilio does is sit in the middle of those two clouds, and we have an API that web developers can use to talk to us, and we talk to a kind of 1,800 or so telcos and make that happen. So it's that kind of, don't sign a big contract and spend lots of money, pay as you go to send and receive text messages and voice calls as a developer in any language using a REST API, and kind of take care of the rest. So we've spent the past few years building an API, and I wanted to share with you some of the stuff that we've learned as we've done that. The Twilio's been around since 2008. It's a San Francisco-based company. I work out of our London office. So we've been around for a while. We've learned a few things as we've gone along building our API. One of the first things that I really wanted to share with you is this idea of, while who your API is for is important, if you're starting out building or working with an API, you actually need to start with thinking about what's new. Why are you thinking about an API in the first place? Is it because it's a buzzword and a senior manager has said we need an API? Because if so, that's not real, that's a Dilbert comic. You don't want to do that. So think about what actual net new stuff using an API could bring to your company, to your product, to the things you're doing or the people you're working with. Do you need one? If you do, what's it going to do? I mean, there were some great examples earlier and talked about yesterday. Tesla are bringing great new innovations to cars. I really want a Tesla car because they're electric and they're powered by software and it's great. And anything that Elon Musk does is awesome. So I want a Tesla based on that. But their API wasn't really documented. It wasn't thought through. People didn't think about, let's build this with an API. They just kind of had one because they needed one internally, and it got hacked and exploited in the same way that Snapchat's did. Hacking someone's car, a little bit worse than hacking their fridge or an app on their phone. So they didn't necessarily think about the API as something that was core to their business, but it was there, and they didn't give it the attention that it needed to make it safe and secure. Maybe your API is like Tesla's. It's not core to what you're doing, but it's something that you need to have to help make your product work. Does anyone in here use Twitter? Yeah? Good. Quite a lot of people. You know, when I did talks 5 years ago and asked that question, a lot of people looked at me very blankly. But back when Twitter first launched, it looked like that. It was in that kind of startup trend of nobody putting vowels in their product names. I'm not even sure how I'm supposed to say that. I don't know. But Twitter was particularly ugly when it first launched. But Twitter's strategy at first was to have an API. Twitter really wanted to reach scale and get a lot of users very quickly. And it knew that there were so many different platforms, so many different areas that it could go into. It was designed originally to be a service you could text, but there was also that box there that said, what are you doing? That you could type some text inside of. And wouldn't it be great if you could do that from your phone, if you had a smartphone with a data connection? Wouldn't it be great if you could do that from your PDA? Wouldn't it be great if your futuristic fridge could do that? And so the idea of having an API for Twitter was an incredibly powerful part of their business model, because they were able to say, we're not going to write any native apps ourselves, we'll let other people do it for us. Now, when I first joined Twitter in 2007 as a user, I had a Windows Mobile 6.1 PDA device. Don't shoot me. It was 2007. I saw an iPhone later that year and my world was changed forever. But I suddenly had a device that could run apps, and I had a Twitter application for it. I downloaded the .cab file and installed it. It was a brilliant install process, but it wasn't made by Twitter. Someone else made that and used Twitter's API. And then lots of apps like that sprung up for lots of different platforms, for lots of different devices, and suddenly Twitter was available to anyone, and it was available everywhere, and people started using it. How many of you would have still used Twitter if there wasn't an app available for it on your platform of choice? And as much as Twitter have changed their strategy more recently and decided to close off access to their API and restrict it and release their own apps, that's because the company has changed and evolved. Their early business model relied on APIs, and they had thought about it from the start. It's a very big difference between Tesla and Twitter. Tech companies do seem to begin with T for some reason. Tesla just didn't think about the API to start off with. Twitter, the API was very important to what they needed to do. It's also important to think about when you're looking at building or using an API, what does it actually do? So there are a lot of APIs out there that do a lot of different things. They can get quite complicated. But there are APIs that do lots of different things, and they can work in different ways for different customers, different users. There's probably a use case for an API for any product you're building if you think less in terms of developers and techie people and more in terms of something that gives access to the data that you've got in your organization. Tesco is a giant supermarket chain in the UK, and increasingly abroad. They seem to be taking that kind of divide and conquer mentality to go everywhere. I can't go to a foreign country now without seeing some kind of Tesco shop or the other, but Tesco are absolutely massive in the UK and are well known for food, for groceries. That's what they do. But they have an API. Now, their API is really simple, and what it does is it gives you a JSON or XML file that contains all their product information. So prices, pictures, product title and description for all of their products. They also have things like what was its last price, so that you can tell if it's come down in price or up in price, kind of at the last update. And so while that doesn't necessarily seem like the most useful thing on paper, what that does is anyone out there that is building an app or mashing up data and wants to consume data around the price of bread or milk, if they're looking at things like inflation, or they want to build an online shopping experience that brings in things from other brands, Tesco have an API that people can use and sign up for freely and have quite an unrestricted access to. So it's a supermarket with an API, but they've thought very carefully about what their API does and what it doesn't do. So they've not created an API that just does everything. They've thought very carefully about what they want their API to do. There's nothing in that API that lets me open and close the doors in different supermarkets around the UK. That would be scope creep. It would be pointless. But it's very, very good for doing things with the price of groceries. And while that might not appeal to you, there might be a whole bunch of developers that does appeal to. There's another great example of that, the Absolute Drinks database, which I'm personally quite a big fan of. And it's a third-party API. So this is someone who has built their API on top of other data and on top of other data sets, but they've pulled it together in a way that makes a lot of sense for the people that want to use it. So you get very clear, very concise ways of being able to look at things that like kind of brands and variants of Absolute Vodka and the types of drinks that you can mix with that as well. It's an API dedicated to Absolute Vodka. Does that appeal to anyone else in the room? Because I think that's great. But it's also important not just to think about what it can do initially and what it actually does, but what it can do. So if you're building your own API into what you're doing, there's this idea of always working to a minimum viable product to start off with. When you've already got a product that exists and you're writing an API to work with that, that's really hard to do. Because you know what your product does, you know all of the things that this API could do, and so you're going to go ahead and try and build an API that does all of the stuff that you want it to do. If Tesco had done that, I really would be able to open the doors in every shop with the API. If this API had tried to do that, then it probably wouldn't exist, because it's brilliant because it's so simple. But thinking about what your API actually can do, what it could do next, what the version 2, what the version 3 could be, is a really, really important thing to do as well. So when Twilio first launched in 2008, we did not do voice, SMS, voice, SIP, etc., all of the stuff that we do now. When Twilio first launched in 2008, we had a minimum viable product, and what we could do was voice, and we focused on it being a voice API and doing that as well as we possibly could. So that's our CEO right now in 2014. In 2008, he had slightly more hair and was smiling a bit more, so it's a sign of how hard he's worked on bringing Twilio to life. But 2008, we launched with a voice API. And that was what we went and talked about. And we focused a lot of time on making sure that worked really well, and it was great. And we had a case study. We launched with a case study of people using our voice API. Duma are an organization that help give homeless youth shifts of work to earn some money. And so they were homeless young people all over North America that could get hooked up with a shift working in a juice shack or a Ben & Jerry's ice cream parlor serving food and stuff like that. But they were faced with this logistical issue of how do they get young people notified of when their shift is, remind them, and then get them there. And so we worked with them as our first case study, and they were giving all of these young people feature phones, dumb phones, just phones that could do calling and text, no kind of data plans or anything like that. Things that were quite hard wearing. And they then set up a service whereby a young person would get a phone call, and it would be an automated call saying, "Hi, there's a shift available for you at this juice shack in 3 days' time. It's 6 hours. Do you want to accept this? Press 1 if you want to work the shift, press 2 if you don't." They press 2 if they don't want to, automatically phones the next person on the list until someone accepts that job. It would then remind them an hour beforehand that their shift was due to work, give them directions down the phone of how to get there. And that was all automated using our voice API. So we had a minimum viable product, and our MVP had a case study that made sense, and we could use it. And before we focused on anything else, before we thought about bringing things like SMS and MMS and VoIP and all the other things we did on the platform, we focused on doing one thing really well. And the great thing about releasing a minimum viable product and getting our API out there was that people started using it in ways that we hadn't even thought of. So you might have a great idea in your head around what your API can do, but software developers and people that play with APIs are generally really, really cool. Does anyone in here want to disagree with developers being really, really cool? Good, playing to a home crowd. Developers have brilliant imaginations. And when you give someone an API, they might think, I could do something brilliant with that you never even thought they could do. So now that Twilio has grown and evolved from our voice API and does so much more, we've seen customers do really amazing things with it. There's a company in the UK called Amigo Loans, and they've built an entire call center with no hardware. So all it is browser-based calling out to the standard phone network for support, incoming calls, the kind of stuff that you'd spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on putting hardware in a cupboard for. They now do using our API, and a bit of code. And they're able to integrate that with their CRM systems and all of that kind of thing. And we never really thought at the start, hey, this could be a complete replacement for a call center, but it can be, and it is, and people have gone and done that and built on that. From a less business point of view, people were even realizing that when you put phone numbers in people's hands and make the phone network easily accessible to developers, they could be creative with it. So there's a digital agency called Poke in London, and they made it snow at Christmas. This is a bit Internet of Things as well. So they had a snow machine up on the roof, and they had a number on the wall, and you would phone a phone number, and it would then start the snow machine and play Let It Snow down the phone to you. So you made it snow with a phone call. There are other great examples of people being really creative. One in Bristol where you could text things like post boxes and lampposts and tell the city how you were feeling about it. So Bristol was able to tell whether people loved living in the city or visiting the city or not based on the conversations they had. Even Coca-Cola, who uses to send their Coke machines, can send text messages to the nearest engineer and tell them what's wrong, which is just a bizarre use case that we'd never have thought of, but it's there and it works. So we built an API on top of existing infrastructure. We built an API on top of the telephony network, and we integrated with that. Are you going to integrate with your product? Are you going to build an API that works with a lot of different things? There are so many different bits and pieces that you can do. And like I said, ours just kind of sits in the middle. Think about where your API sits. Do developers use it to integrate with your product or to integrate with a whole bunch of different products? So in summary, there are a few things to take away from this presentation. If you're going to build an API, please don't be insecure about it. Otherwise you will be a headline like Snapchat or like that fridge. If you're going to build an API, don't start by building an SDK. Start by building your API. Start by making something that works with your product, that does something for the users and for people. Don't be fast about it. Take your time. Think about what you want your API to do, who might use it. Dog fooding is brilliant. Get people to try it out internally before they try it out externally. People are going to be your biggest, greatest asset. Get people testing it, get people using it, get people to give you the ideas for what they can build on top of your API. Don't just pay lip service to building it. If you're going to have an API, document it, be committed about it, and keep supporting it. But most importantly, with all of that very scary stuff, please don't do nothing. Because APIs are brilliant. APIs are the future. APIs are the modern day equivalent of what networking was. It's connectivity between apps, between services for the 21st century and beyond, and we need APIs. So please, build them, use them, make them happen. And if that's still a bit scary, in the words of one of my favorite authors, please don't panic. Thank you.